Hello, I hope you are doing well today, and I'm here to read chapter 26, sorry for the bump, of If We Were Giants, and it is the last three chapters of our story. So this week you'll hear 26, 27, 28, and then there'll be just a really quick video about the author's notes. So there'll be 4 videos for us this week. So sorry, we're trying to get my kitten used to the playpen. So if you hear just scratching, you know what it is. So Tiha blew her horn once and motioned to those in the trees in front of theirs, closer to the river. The tree folk hidden in the branches of 4 separate trunks leaped into action, jumping out of their limbs and assembling their puppet in an instant. Suddenly, 4 forest giants appeared seemingly out of nowhere and stood in front of the advancing warriors. The people working the mouths screamed into their horns and pumped the levers that moved the jaws, and it looked like a quartet of monsters bellowing and gnashing teeth in rage. The charge faltered as the soldiers took them in. These giants were enormous, at least twice again as large as the original one, and Kira could tell by the wide eyes of the warriors that they were looking at more than what they had bargained for. But to the raiders' credit, their hesitation only lasted a moment before their battle cries increased in intensity and they resumed charging at double speed. The 2 groups met in an explosion of violence. The giants smashed down with their great wooden fists, knocking soldiers this way and that, sweeping whole groups of them aside like dolls. The giants stomped too, their heavy legs raised high into the air before crashing down on the warriors' helmets, knocking many of them senseless. But there was just too many soldiers. They swarmed the giants from all sides, and soon the huge puppets were waiting in a sea of them. Several takers jumped up as far as they could, grabbed the joints of the giants' knees, and hung on fiercely, then climbed hand over hand toward the control center behind each giant's face. The people working in the giants' arms had to spend their time and energy brushing these interlopers off in their wooden bodies and could no longer fight the ones in the ground. This gave the warriors with hatchets the opening they needed. Rushing right up to the giants, they began hacking away, the hefty blades digging in and sending showers of wood chips spraying into the air. Soon the 4 towering giants were in bad shape. 3 of them were missing arms where several invaders had climbed up the body, jumped onto the forearm, and hung there, letting their combined weight rip the shoulder joint right out of the socket. The giants were all stumbling around, their legs hacked up and decimated, threatening to give out altogether and come crashing down. Tiha blew 3 short blasts of her horn, the signal for retreat. The giants turned and limp ran desperately for the trees like scared and wounded animals. They teetered unsteadily on chewed-up legs as they plunged down the underbrush. A war of laughter erupted from the warriors below. This was going to be too easy. They regrouped into formation and marched resolutely after their prey, into the heart of the forest itself. Kira watched the takers move directly underneath the tree, line after line of them, washing through like rolling waves. When the 4 battered giants had plunged deep into the woods, the tree folk inside abandoned their sections, leaped into the branches of the surrounding trees, and disappeared into the leaves. The giants clattered lifelessly to the ground, their parts reduced to debris on the forest floor. The warriors stopped in their tracks, perplexed. There was no one left to charge. Standing in the middle of the trees, they looked down at the pieces of the giants, and then around at the still, silent forest. Had they won already? That's when Tiha blew her horn again. One long and steady blast. Attack. Kira and her crew leapt into action, and she traded her stationary spot in a solid tree for a perch in a walking giant. All around, tree folk were doing the same. In a huge circle surrounding the soldiers, giants sprang to life everywhere, 10, then 20, 30, and more. It was as if the entire forest was coming to life to protect this land. That's when the real battle began. Kira lost perspective on the overall picture. Her world narrowed down to what was happening directly in front of her. Tiha's strong brothers were working the legs in unison, and her giant charged directly into the thick mass of warriors. Kira held on tight with both hands as she was nearly jolted out of her seat, not expecting how violently the giant would stagger and shudder as it crashed against all of those solid, struggling bodies. She and Luan were working the same arm, and they swung it with all of their might. The wood smashed against the enemy, snapping shields in half and sending bodies flying through the air. "Look out!" Luan yelled and pointed behind her. Kira turned her head. From a crack between the sapling logs that made up the arm, she could see a raider climbing towards her. He had a knife clenched between his teeth and murderous rage in his eyes. She knew from watching earlier, if enough of his fellow warriors got up there, the giant's arm would be ripped off and she and Luan would go tumbling into the rolling sea of soldiers with nothing to protect them. They would be stomped into oblivion or pulled from the wreckage of the puppet to meet those cruel weapons. Kira grabbed one of the dozen sticks that she had stashed near her perch just for this reason. The end of each stick had been sharpened to a point. She gripped it with both hands, waiting for the bated breath until the warrior climbed right up into where she was seated, and then jabbed the spike through a crack in the logs with all of her might. The point caught the warrior in the face. He screamed and dropped to the forest floor. She turned and realized that Luan was doing the same thing. Raising her head to look through a viewing portal, Kira saw that their giant was free of climbing for the moment. She also got a broader look at the battle in the forest. It was impossible to tell which way it was going. True, the bodies of many soldiers were strewn about the forest floor, but the giants had taken their losses as well. Some had limbs missing, while others had been hacked apart entirely, the jagged piece of the construction lying in ruins. The tree folk operating those giants had made the ultimate sacrifice for their land and their people. An overwhelming sadness threatened to paralyze Kira, but she pushed that thought aside. They would honor their fallen brothers and sisters later. First, there was still a job to be done. "Tiha," McKenna screeched from the other side of the puppet, where she and Akari were working on the other arm. "Look, over there. A group of them is trying to break the circle." Kira knew this was bad. Their entire plan, after luring the takers into the forest and ambushing them with the entire army of giants, was to corral the soldiers, keep them contained, and fight them until they were all down or until they surrendered. If they let the circle be broken, the warriors could hide up and regroup, and then the elements of surprise and control would be on their side. For the tree folk, unskilled in battle, this would spell doom. They had to finish this with the first wave of attacks, or else they'd be at a serious disadvantage. Tiha responded immediately. She thrust a brightly colored flag on top of the giant's head, a signal to the surrounding puppets to follow her. Her brothers worked the legs with everything they had, and their giant raced towards the breach in the circle, where a mass of takers had ripped down 2 puppets and were working on a third, making a hole in the line of defense that they could pour through. Kira's giant just got there in time with the reinforcements. Excuse me. I hope you don't yawn from that. They rushed into the hole, covering like a leaky hole at the bottom of a gourd. 3 soldiers managed to slip through before the reinforcements got there. Tiha directed her brothers, and the giant chased them down. Luan and Kira worked the arms in a frenzy of activity. Today, they thrust an enormous wooden hand down at the warriors, scooped them all up in a single handful, and then smashed them right against the broad trunk of a nearby tree. The warriors fell nimbly to the ground. Their giant worked with the orders to repel the invaders trying to bust through. The soldiers already gave up. turned and ran to help in another part of the battle, but it was becoming increasingly difficult for the enemy to find a strategic place to join the fight. Although some of the giants were maimed or had brought down altogether, most of the army still stood. Kira's heart soared at the sight. They were winning. They were going to do this. "Oh no," Luan barely croaked it out, but Kira was already able to hear him since they were so close. "Oh no." She turned to look at him and found an expression on his face of utter shock and dismay. "What?" she screamed at him. "What is it?" He merely pointed into the distance. Her gaze followed, and there, back toward the river, she saw one thing that frightened a forest dweller more than anything else in the world. Smoke. Ruh-roh. So I'll be back for chapter 27 later. Bye.